Today I'm interviewing my friend Ed Sunshine, who is a theologian who taught for many years at Barry University in Miami. Ed, could you tell us something about your book and why you wrote it and essentially what the focus is?
Sure, I'll be glad to. This is the book. I wrote it over a period of about 13 years or so. It's not really my own production, it's a translation and a critical edition of a manuscript never published as a book, but handwritten, which was a critique and actually an attack on the slave situation in Cuba in the late 17th century. The title of the book is A Just Defense of the Natural Freedom of Slaves. All slaves should be free. It was the events that occurred that resulted in the manuscript were in 1681. The manuscript itself was finished in 1682. The author of the book is a man named Epifanio de Moran. He was from a part of what is now France. A companion of his, part of the whole story, is a man named Francisco Jose de Jaca. Jaca is a city in the Aragon Valley of Spain, up against the Pyrenees Mountains. He was a member of the Capuchin order also. These two men were missionaries. They went to the colonies. Epifanio went to what is now Venezuela. At that time, it was called Nueva Andalucía. And Francisco Jose went to what is now modern-day Cartagena, Colombia. Both of these missionaries began doing their pastoral work in those areas. Both of them, independent of each other, discovered abuses. The colonial system under the Spanish governors taking advantage, especially of the natives, the Indians, indigenous people, but also of the slaves that were being used on the plantations. And they criticized the whole slave system in those two areas, Colombia and modern-day Venezuela. As a result of what they were doing, they disturbed a lot of people, especially the authorities. And so, of course, they were kicked out of those places. And they were put on ships and sent to Havana, Cuba, to await passage to Spain. So they were being sent back to Europe, ending their missionary work. The two met each other in Havana. And by talking with each other, they discovered that they both had the same concerns, especially about slavery, because Cuba at that time was just beginning the whole development of the slave system to harvest the sugar and the tobacco, the crops that were bringing in money for the owners of the plantations there. And so these two men decided that they had to do something about it. Now, just to give a little indication of what we're talking about. It's not as if all missionaries became activists against slavery as these two men did. In fact, a number of members of the Franciscan orders and apparently a number of diocesan clergy were aware of the abuses of slavery, and they were sympathetic to what these two men were doing. But slavery had been something that had been condoned by church leaders for centuries. In fact, from the very beginning, the church had kind of a conflicted opinion or conflicted teaching on slavery. In the Gospels, for instance, Jesus never talks about the institution of slavery. It was just an accepted fact of life. However, Jesus, if you go to the original languages, you'll find that Jesus did use the term slaves in his parables, in his teachings, in his metaphors. But church leaders after Jesus started trying to clean up that harsh word for their own reasons, whatever it was. Probably a part of that was to fit in with the civil society of the time. And even in our modern day translations, in some editions of the Gospels, for instance, the word that Jesus uses for slaves, doulos, is translated as servant. And so they're trying to mitigate the meaning of the word, because a servant is not a slave. A slave is somebody who is owned by somebody else. A servant is in a different kind of working condition. St. Paul famously declared, slaves, obey your masters. Not necessarily because he wanted the institution to exist and thrive, but because Christians at that time, this is the very early church, were in a vulnerable position. They were considered what we would call a cult, a group of people that had different religious beliefs and went contrary to the accepted religious norms of the time. Paul tried to mitigate the harsh penalties and the harsh treatment of the slaves, especially when Paul tried to write a letter to a slave owner whose slave, Onesimus, had escaped and come to Paul for help. Paul sent him back, but pleaded with the slave owner to try to treat Onesimus as a fellow Christian and to be merciful to him. This kind of conflicted situation continued through Christian centuries. And mainly, this was the case in Europe, at least in a Christian context, all the way through the Middle Ages. There were some people who were enslaved. They were enslaved for various reasons. So, for instance, in the medieval understanding of war, prisoners of war could be executed. However, as an act of mercy, their captors could make slaves of them rather than executing them. And so it was an alternative that preserved their lives. Just as a side note, we might think about our current practices of capital punishment. We don't give the alternative of preserving life if a verdict of capital punishment comes down. So the question arises, were the people in the Middle Ages who captured prisoners of war more merciful than we are? Another reason that people in the Middle Ages became slaves was simply that they were so poor they couldn't feed themselves, and so they would sell themselves into slavery just to preserve their lives. And this was an accepted practice of making slaves and getting slaves. Another way that people became slaves was in terms of a father selling his children to keep the rest of the family alive or to get money or for whatever reason. And this was accepted as a valid kind of practice, even though those kinds of things shock us today. Now, that was the general background of Christian practice and Christian teaching accepting slavery throughout the Middle Ages.